Okay, so now that we've got our basic document, we're going to be looking at loading in an external style sheet. Now by this I mean that the styles aren't on the page, they are on your web server somewhere, maybe in a folder. In our case, we're working inside this website directory, which remember we have open in our browser. So what we can actually do is we can create a folder here and then reference that file. So inside of here, I'm going to create a new folder and I'm going to call this CSS. And this is typically where you would find style sheets stored. Now, CSS stands for Cascading Style Sheets, and we'll talk a little bit about that when we look into CSS. But this is generally where you'd find things stored in a CSS directory. So let's create a new file inside of our text area and let's save this. Now we're going to save this obviously inside of our CSS directory, and I'm going to call this main.css. It's important to know that when you're writing CSS, there are exceptions to this, but you'll want all of your styles within one file, generally. Now, sometimes there are technologies that are used like Sass, which basically allow you to structure your styles in a way that you can use things like variables. And if you've ever worked with any other programming languages, you'll know what a variable is. But we're going to be writing pure CSS here because we're just looking at an introduction to front-end web development. So we're not going to have, say, something like style sheet for just buttons, or a style sheet for just links, or a style sheet for just your header or your footer of your page. We're going to create one style sheet, and throughout the series we'll be using one style sheet. Now there are exceptions to that. When we go to look at things like frameworks and when we look at grid systems, we'll be including in additional style sheets. That's just to keep things separate for versioning pretty much. But let's go ahead and see what we can do here. So how do we start writing CSS? Now the way you look at CSS is you're targeting elements within your markup. Now we haven't loaded this style sheet in yet, so we can't actually do anything. There's no relation between these two files at the moment. This page that we've created needs to request our style sheet in order for it to be displayed. And remember, I said this is added to the head of the page. Now I did forget something in the last part, and this is the character encoding for the page, and this is really, really important. The reason this is important is because when you don't declare character encoding, there can be security issues, because essentially what you're doing is you're not declaring how your characters that are output, maybe from PHP on the back end or from anywhere really, you're not controlling how they are shown. You're not telling the page how these should be shown. So we use the meta element for this. Now we don't need to end this. We're going to say character set equals UTF-8. Now I'm not going to go too much into character encoding, but this is generally the character set you'd want to use. So we now have a document. We're ready to start styling something up. How do we link our style sheet in? We've already seen this in the Wikipedia example, but we're going to use the link element here. Now we're going to say rel equals style sheet, and you'll hear me refer to these things here as attributes. They're attributes of this element. So we have two attributes here, one telling us what this actually is, it's a style sheet, and the href, which is basically telling us where this is located. So we know that it's located in the CSS directory and it's called main.css. So we can say css/main.css, and that's it. Now when we head over to our browser and refresh, nothing really happens. We don't see any difference here. Number one, because we don't have any elements on the page, and number two, because we haven't actually written any styles. So let's test out styling, just for something very, very basic. We'll create a paragraph and we will color all paragraphs red, for example. So let's create a paragraph here and we'll call this Hello World, and let's just check that out in the browser. There we go, it's there. Now inside of main.css, let's take a look at the syntax of CSS, the basic syntax of CSS. And this will work the same for any selector that you use. So what we basically have is we have a selector. Now this isn't actually CSS, I'm just writing this as just to sort of pseudocode if you like. This is the selector. We have an opening curly bracket and a closing curly bracket and nothing else. Then for our next selector, we say selector 2, and we write more CSS. And these just go down, down, and down the page. Now, there are exceptions to this, things like working with responsive design, for example, working with media queries. These you can nest things, but generally what we're going to be looking at is just the name or the sort of selector of the element, and then the styles go in here. So the selector in our case, we need to target the P element, or all P elements we're going to target. How do you think we're going to do that? Well, it's extremely simple. We're just going to say P. And you can see that my text editor is highlighting this for me. So P, opening bracket, closing bracket, all of the styles we do go on new lines within this element here. So for example, say I want to change the color of the text to red. The CSS property for this, and this is called a property, is called color. Now we say color or whatever property that we're using, we say colon, and then we say the name of the color. And this can be an HTML color like red or slate gray, or whatever you want to do. Or it can be a hex value, or we can use functions like RGB, or we can use functions like HSL. We're not going to be looking at this too much because you can go ahead and look at that yourself. But for example, now I'm just going to say red, and you can play around with what you can do here. So when I refresh now, you see that the color of that paragraph has been changed to red. Cool. So we've written our first HTML and we've written our first CSS. And you've basically targeted all paragraph elements here. Now, if I was to duplicate this down, you'll see that that other paragraph will also be red. P, like that, means every paragraph element to infinity, however many you include on there. So that's basically how we link in a style sheet. We've looked at a very, very basic style. In the next video, we're going to look at targeting elements a little bit more. We're going to look at a few more complicated examples.